John Parker, a middle-aged black man in his late 40s, leaned back in his office chair and rubbed his temples. The steady hum of fluorescent lights above created a strangely soothing background noise as he saved his last email draft of the day. His watch ticked softly as he glanced at the time. It was 5:30 p.m. A hint of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. It was a Friday evening, which meant a trip to the neighborhood grocery store. For John, these quiet errands were his moment of peace in a week filled with deadlines and meetings. He cherished the simplicity of picking up fresh produce, chatting with familiar faces, and planning meals for the weekend. Outside his modest office building, the crisp spring air greeted him. John paused for a moment on the sidewalk, closing his eyes and letting the sunlight warm his face. The world felt calm, predictable. He couldn't have known that within hours, his life would take an unexpected turn. John's car, a well-used but reliable Toyota Camry, sat waiting for him in the parking lot. Its dark blue paint had faded over the years, but to John, it wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of steady, dependable progress. He slid into the driver's seat, tuned the radio to his favorite station, and hummed along to an old blues tune as he drove to the store. The local supermarket, a Kroger on the edge of his suburban neighborhood, buzzed with its usual evening activity. John pushed his cart through the aisles, mentally checking off items from his list. Whole grain bread, almond milk, a bag of Granny Smith apples. As he reached for a can of black beans, he noticed an older woman on her tiptoes struggling to grab a jar from the top shelf. "Excuse me, ma'am," John said gently. "Can I help you with that?" The woman turned toward him, her wrinkled face breaking into a grateful smile. "Oh, thank you, young man. I don't know what I'd do without kind folks like you." John chuckled and handed her the jar with ease. "Happy to help." Moments like this reminded him why he loved his neighborhood, a tight-knit community where people looked out for one another. At the checkout counter, the cashier greeted him with a friendly smile. "Hey, Mr. Parker. Stocking up for the weekend?" "Trying to," John replied with a grin. "You know how it is. There's always something I forget." They chatted briefly while the cashier scanned his items. As he placed the last bag into his cart, John felt a deep sense of contentment. Life wasn't extravagant, but it was good. On his way back home, John parked his car in the driveway of his small but cozy bungalow. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the laughter of children playing down the street. With a bag in each hand, he began the short walk to his front door. The evening air smelled of freshly cut grass and blooming azaleas. John made a mental note to call his mother and check on her. She'd been busy with her church's community garden project, and he wanted to hear all about it. But just as he turned the corner onto his street, the tranquil scene shattered. The piercing wail of sirens broke through the serenity of the evening, sending a jolt of alarm through John. Red and blue lights flickered rapidly, illuminating the peaceful suburban street in bursts of chaos. As the sound grew louder, John froze in his tracks, grocery bags dangling at his sides. Before he could process what was happening, 3 police cars screeched to a halt in front of him, their tires leaving black streaks on the pavement. Doors flew open, and officers poured out, their movements swift and calculated. Guns were drawn, their barrels aimed squarely at John. "Drop the bags. Put your hands where we can see them," an officer barked, his voice harsh and commanding. Shock rippled through John's body. The weight of the situation crushed him as he tried to comprehend what was happening. The grocery bags slipped from his trembling hands, scattering their contents onto the sidewalk. Apples rolling, a carton of eggs cracking open, milk spilling onto the ground. "Please," John said, his voice shaking as he slowly raised his hands. "There must be some mistake. What's going on?" "Don't move," another officer shouted. "Hands up now." John complied, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear their words. The officers closed in on him, their faces tense with suspicion. "John Parker?" one of them demanded, his steely eyes narrowing. "Yes, that's me," John replied cautiously. "But what is this about?" We're investigating a robbery that took place at a gas station 2 blocks from here, the officer snapped. The suspect was described as a middle-aged black man named John. You match the description. Confusion and indignation welled up inside him. No, there must be a mistake. I've been at the store. I just got back from grocery shopping. The officers exchanged skeptical glances. Save it for the station, one muttered. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. John swallowed hard, the weight of their words sinking in. He considered arguing further but knew it wouldn't help. Slowly, he turned, his mind racing. He felt the cold steel of handcuffs snapping around his wrists. Please, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. Check my receipt. Look at the store's security cameras. I didn't do anything. His pleas went unanswered. The officers roughly patted him down, their hands searching for weapons he didn't have. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Whispers and murmurs spread through the crowd. That's John from down the street, someone said. He's always been so kind. Why would they arrest him? Another asked, confusion etched on their face. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow who lived 2 doors down, gasped audibly. John would never hurt anyone. This can't be right. John lowered his head, humiliation washing over him. He could feel the weight of their stares, their judgment, and their sympathy. The officers forced him into the back seat of one of the patrol cars, slamming the door behind him. As the car sped away, John caught a final glimpse of his spilled groceries and the faces of his bewildered neighbors. Part 3. Injustice in motion. The ride to the police station felt surreal. The world outside the patrol car blurred past him, but John's mind was stuck on a loop, replaying the arrest over and over. His heart ached with disbelief and anger. How could something like this happen to him, a man who had spent his life following the rules and doing everything right? At the station, the officers marched him into a sterile, fluorescent-lit room. They sat him down at a desk where a gruff-looking officer began typing on a computer. Name? The officer asked, not bothering to look up. John Parker, John said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The officer typed the name into a database, then turned to another officer. Get his fingerprints and take a mugshot. As they led John to the fingerprint station, he felt a wave of indignity wash over him. His hands, now free from the cuffs but still sore, pressed against the ink pad. He stared at the camera during the mugshot, trying to suppress the humiliation burning inside him. You've got the wrong person, John said firmly, breaking the tense silence. I wasn't near that gas station. I can prove it. Tell it to the detectives, the officer muttered, ushering him toward a holding cell. The metal door clanged shut behind him, leaving John alone in the small, cold room. He sank onto the bench, running his hands over his face. Questions filled his mind. How long would he be here? Would anyone believe him? Suddenly, commotion erupted outside the cell. An officer opened the door abruptly, his face pale and flustered. Mr. Parker, come with me, the officer said, his tone markedly softer than before. John stood, his confusion deepening. As they walked through the station's labyrinth of hallways, he was brought into a small room filled with officers, including a man who appeared to be the chief. The air was heavy with tension. Mr. Parker, the chief began, his expression a mix of regret and discomfort. It appears we've made a grave mistake. John furrowed his brow. A mistake? We've reviewed the evidence, and it's clear you weren't involved in the robbery, the chief explained. Your alibi checks out. You were indeed at the grocery store, but there's more. John's chest tightened. More? The chief exchanged a glance with another officer before continuing. During our investigation, we uncovered something about your family. Are you aware of your father's identity? John blinked in surprise. My father? No, I never knew him. My mom didn't talk about him much. The chief hesitated, then said, Your father was Richard Parker. He was a prominent civil rights activist in the 1960s, a true hero who fought for justice and equality. John staggered backward, gripping the edge of a nearby chair for support. His father? A civil rights leader? The revelation hit him like a tidal wave. I didn't know," John whispered. At that moment, the station doors swung open with a bang, and in marched a petite but fierce woman, his mother, Mary Parker. "Where's my son?" Mary demanded, her voice cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. "Mrs. Parker," the chief began, but Mary wasn't interested in pleasantries. She spotted John and rushed to his side, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Are you okay, baby? What did they do to you?" "I'm fine, Mom," John said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "But they just told me about Dad." Mary's eyes softened and she looked at him with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Oh, John. I'm sorry you had to find out this way." She turned to the chief, her eyes blazing. "Do you realize what you've done? You've humiliated my son, disrespected our family, and tarnished the legacy of his father, a man who fought for the very rights you've just trampled on." The officers shifted uncomfortably, their heads hanging low. The chief stepped forward, his face etched with shame. "Mrs. Parker, Mr. Parker," he said solemnly, "we cannot apologize enough for our actions. We made assumptions that were unfair and unjust. Your family's legacy deserves better." Mary's jaw tightened, but she held her head high. "You're right about that. My husband gave everything for this country to see progress. Yet here we are." As the chief continued his apology, the weight of the situation pressed down on everyone in the room. John's thoughts swirled with questions about the father he had never known, the injustice he had just endured, and the legacy he was now tied to in a way he had never imagined. One of the officers stepped forward, holding a small, crumpled receipt in his hand. "We've verified your alibi, Mr. Parker. The receipt from the grocery store matches the time of the robbery. We also checked the store's surveillance footage. It confirms you were there during the incident." Mary scoffed, her arms crossed. "That's what it took? A receipt? My son's integrity and the respect he's earned in this community should have been enough." John placed a calming hand on his mother's shoulder. "It's okay, Mom. Let's just go home." But Mary wasn't finished. "No, John. It's not okay. This isn't just about you. This is about every Black man who's been falsely accused, every family torn apart by assumptions and prejudice. Your father fought to change this world, and clearly, there's still work to be done." The chief nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Parker. We've failed you, and we've failed our community. I can't undo what's been done, but I promise this department will be held accountable. Changes will be made." John looked the chief in the eye, his voice calm but firm. "I hope so, because no one should have to go through what I just went through." As John and Mary left the police station, the evening air felt cool and cleansing. They walked silently to Mary's car, the events of the day weighing heavily on both of them. Once they were on the road, John finally broke the silence. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me about Dad?" Mary's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. She sighed, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I thought I was protecting you. Your father's work made him a target, John. He faced threats, violence, hatred. I didn't want that for you." "But I had a right to know," John said softly, his voice tinged with both sadness and understanding. Mary nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "You're right. I see that now. But when you were young, I was so scared. I wanted to shield you from that pain, from the danger. Maybe I was wrong, but I did what I thought was best at the time." John stared out the window, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. "Tell me about him, Mom. Tell me about Dad." Mary smiled faintly, her voice growing warm as she began to recount stories of Richard Parker, a man of incredible courage and conviction. She spoke of his unwavering belief in equality, his marches and speeches, and the sacrifices he made to bring about change. As they pulled into John's driveway, the conversation continued. They sat in the parked car for hours, Mary sharing memories and John soaking in every word. The next morning, John sat at his kitchen table, his untouched coffee growing cold as he stared at a faded photo Mary had brought over. It showed his father standing tall and proud at a rally, his fist raised in determination. John's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When he opened it, he found several of his neighbors standing outside, their expressions a mix of concern and solidarity. "John," Mrs. Henderson said, stepping forward, "we wanted to check on you. What happened yesterday was wrong, and we want you to know we're here for you." One by one, they shared words of support, their presence a reminder that not everyone saw John through the lens of suspicion. John thanked them, his heart full but heavy. "I appreciate all of you. It means a lot." As the neighbors dispersed, John sat back down, a newfound resolve settling over him. His father's legacy wasn't just a story from the past, it was a call to action. Over the next weeks, John began to engage more with his community, organizing forums to discuss racial bias and advocating for changes within the local police department. With Mary by his side, he honored his father's memory by continuing the fight for justice and equality. The scars of that fateful day would always remain, but they became a reminder of the work still to be done and the power of resilience in the face of injustice. "When you were born, John," Martha began, her voice trembling with the weight of her memories, "your father and I made a promise. We wanted to give you the kind of life we never had. One without fear, without danger lurking around every corner. A life free from the shadow of his work and from the enemies it created." She paused, her eyes misting over as she looked at her son. "But after he passed, I decided to keep that promise. I thought it was the best way to honor his wish to protect you. Maybe I was wrong, but I didn't know what else to do." John listened intently, his heart aching for both the father he never knew and the mother who had carried the burden of this secret alone for decades. Her face, lined with years of sacrifice and silent struggle, told him everything he needed to know about her love for him. "I'm so sorry, John," Martha said, her voice breaking. "I see now that I was wrong to keep this from you. Can you forgive me?" John reached across the table, taking her trembling hand in his own. "Mom, I don't blame you. You did what you thought was right. But I need to know more. Tell me about Dad." Martha nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Her voice grew stronger as she began to recount the story of James Carter, a man whose courage and compassion had left an indelible mark on history. "Your father was a force of nature," she began, her eyes lighting up with pride. "He believed in justice, equality, and the power of love to conquer hate. He lived by that principle every single day, no matter how hard it got." John felt his chest swell with admiration as he listened. Martha continued. "James was always organizing something, peaceful protests, marches, or rallies. He brought people together, gave a voice to those who had been silenced. But it wasn't easy, John. With that work came sacrifices, constant demands on his time, threats from those who wanted to shut him up, and the weight of so many people's hopes resting on his shoulders." She paused, her gaze growing distant as she recalled those tumultuous years. "There were nights I'd watch him come home, exhausted but resolute. He never wavered, not even when the threats became personal, when they targeted us." John squeezed his mother's hand gently, encouraging her to continue. "When you were born, we saw a chance for something different," Martha said softly. "We wanted you to have a life untouched by the chaos, to grow up as John Carter, not just the son of Reverend James Carter." Her voice cracked as she added, "After your father passed, I clung to that wish. I thought I was sparing you from a life of pressure, from being a target for those who still held on to their hate." Tears welled up in Martha's eyes as she looked at John, the love and regret in her expression overwhelming. "I see now that I may have taken something from you, instead of giving you the freedom I thought I was." John sat in silence, absorbing his mother's words. He felt pride swelling in his chest as he learned about his father's bravery and the sacrifices he made. But sadness lingered too. Sadness for the man he'd never known, and for the years he'd spent in the dark about his family's legacy. "Mom," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you have any stories about Dad? Things I might not know?" Martha's eyes brightened slightly as she nodded. "There was this one time," she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Your father was leading a peaceful protest downtown. A group of angry men showed up, trying to intimidate everyone. They shouted, pushed people around. But James? He didn't back down. He just stood there, tall as ever, and said, 'Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that.'" John felt a lump forming in his throat as he imagined the scene. He could almost see his father standing firm in the face of anger, refusing to yield. "But it wasn't always noble speeches and marches," Martha added, her voice softening. "There were so many nights he stayed awake, pacing the house, making sure we were safe. People threw rocks at our windows, called in the middle of the night with threats. Your father carried the weight of those fears, but he never let them stop him." As Martha shared more stories, John began to understand the toll his father's work had taken, not just on James, but on their entire family. "He missed so many of your milestones," Martha admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "Your first steps, your first words. He was out there fighting for a better world, but it came at a cost to us." John nodded, his admiration for both his parents growing with every word. "It must have been hard for you too, Mom," he said gently. Martha gave him a sad smile. "It was," she admitted. "But you know what? Your father never lost hope. No matter how bad things got, he always believed that love would win in the end. He used to say, 'The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.'" Hearing those words, John felt his father's spirit come alive in his heart. James Carter wasn't just a name in history books or an absent figure in his life. He was a real man, flawed, courageous, and deeply committed to the cause of justice. As Martha finished recounting her memories, John sat quietly, the weight of her words settling over him. The pride he felt for his father was immense, but so was the sadness for all the moments they never shared. "Mom," John said after a long silence, "I wish I could have known him, even just for a little while, to ask him what kept him going, how he stayed strong when the world seemed so broken." Martha's eyes softened, her expression full of love and understanding. "He would have told you what he always told me, John. One person can't change the world overnight, but they can start a ripple, and ripples grow." John nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of his father's courage and sacrifices. He felt a powerful urge to learn more, not just from his mother, but from anyone who had known James Carter. The next morning, John woke with a renewed sense of purpose. He decided to reach out to Reverend Michael Howard, an old family friend and one of James's closest allies during the civil rights movement. After a quick search online, he found Reverend Howard's contact information and gave him a call. "Reverend Howard?" John asked hesitantly when the elderly man answered. "Yes, this is he," came the warm reply. "This is John Carter, James Carter's son." A long pause followed before Reverend Howard spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "John, my boy, it's good to hear from you. I've thought about you and your mother often over the years. How are you?" "I'm doing okay," John replied. "I was hoping we could meet. I'd like to learn more about my father, about the work he did with you." Reverend Howard readily agreed, and they arranged to meet at a small coffee shop later that week. The coffee shop was quiet when John arrived, the soft hum of conversation mingling with the smell of fresh pastries and brewing espresso. He spotted Reverend Howard seated at a corner table, his silver hair neatly combed and his posture upright despite his years. "John," Reverend Howard said warmly as he stood to greet him, "you have your father's eyes." They sat together, and over steaming cups of coffee, Reverend Howard began to share stories of James Carter's work. "Your father was a leader, John, but he never acted like he was above anyone else. He believed in listening, really listening, to people's struggles. He used to say that change starts with understanding." Reverend Howard's stories painted a vivid picture of James as a man who balanced unyielding determination with deep empathy. He spoke of sit-ins at segregated diners, marches through hostile towns, and late-night meetings where strategies for peaceful protest were planned. One time, Reverend Howard recounted, your father organized a march through a small town in the Deep South. The sheriff there was notorious for his hatred and violence. But your father wasn't deterred. He led that march with his head held high, and by the end of it, even some of the locals who'd opposed us were clapping along to the songs we sang. John listened intently, feeling a profound connection to his father's legacy. But as he absorbed these tales of courage and conviction, a question gnawed at him. Reverend Howard? John began hesitantly. How did my father handle the fear, the constant threats, the danger to our family? How did he keep going? Reverend Howard's expression grew somber. Your father was human, John. He felt fear, just like anyone else, but he believed that the work he was doing was more important than his own safety. He used to tell me, I'd rather risk my life for what's right than live in silence. The weight of those words settled over John like a heavy blanket. He wondered if he had inherited even a fraction of that strength and conviction. Over the following weeks, John found himself drawn deeper into his father's world. He visited libraries to research James's speeches and interviews, pored over old photographs his mother had kept hidden away, and reconnected with people who had known his father during the movement. Each discovery brought him closer to the man he'd never known, and with that closeness came a growing sense of responsibility. One evening, as he sat with Martha in the living room, John shared his thoughts. Mom, I can't just go back to my old life. Not after everything I've learned. I feel like I need to do something to make a difference. Martha smiled, pride shining in her eyes. Your father would be so proud of you, John. But remember, making a difference doesn't always mean standing on a stage or leading a march. Sometimes it's the quiet acts of kindness and courage that change the world the most. Her words stayed with John as he considered how to honor his father's legacy in his own way. He wasn't a fiery orator or a seasoned activist, but he had his own strengths, his empathy, his ability to connect with others, and his unwavering belief in fairness and justice. He decided to start small, volunteering at the local youth center to mentor kids who needed guidance. On his first day, he met Marcus, a shy 12-year-old struggling with math and self-confidence. Mr. John, Marcus asked hesitantly one afternoon, how do you stay strong when people don't treat you right? John thought for a moment before replying, you stay strong by remembering who you are and what you believe in. My dad used to say that love is stronger than hate, and it's up to us to prove him right. As the days turned into weeks, John found purpose in his work at the youth center. He shared his father's values with the kids, teaching them about resilience, compassion, and the power of standing up for what's right. But the memory of his arrest still lingered. He couldn't shake the feeling that his experience was part of a much larger issue, one that required more than mentoring and small acts of kindness to address. The memory of John's arrest loomed large, not just as a personal injustice, but as a symptom of a broader problem in his community. He knew that his father would have faced such injustices head-on, and John felt compelled to do the same. One evening, after a long day at the youth center, John sat down with his mother to share an idea. Mom, I've been thinking about starting a community program, something that brings people together, residents, police officers, everyone. We need to rebuild trust. Martha nodded, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. It's a big undertaking, John. Are you ready for that? I don't think I can ignore it, John replied. What happened to me isn't unique, and it shouldn't keep happening. Over the next few weeks, John began reaching out to local community leaders, churches, and organizations to gather support for his initiative. He called it Bridge to Justice, a program aimed at fostering understanding between law enforcement and the people they served. At the first meeting, held in the community center gymnasium, John stood at the podium, nervous but resolute. The room was filled with residents, police officers, and even some local government officials. The air buzzed with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Thank you all for coming, John began, his voice steady. I'm here because I believe we can do better. What happened to me? What happens to so many others? It doesn't have to be this way. But change won't happen unless we come together and listen to each other. He shared his story, the fear and humiliation he felt during his arrest, but also his willingness to work with the police to create a better future. His vulnerability struck a chord, and by the end of the night, people were signing up to participate in workshops, discussion groups, and community projects. Bridge to Justice began small but quickly gained momentum. One of its first initiatives was a series of community roundtables where residents and officers could share their perspectives openly and honestly. At one such meeting, a young woman named Tasha stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've lived here my whole life, and I've seen my brothers stopped by the police more times than I can count, for no reason. It makes us feel like we don't belong in our own neighborhood." Officer Rodriguez, one of the officers involved in John's arrest, listened intently. When it was his turn to speak, he stood and addressed Tasha directly. "I can't undo what's happened to you or your family, but I can promise to do better, and I'll start by listening, really listening, to what you're saying." The room fell silent as Tasha nodded, her expression softening. It was a small moment, but one that felt monumental. Inspired by the progress made during these discussions, John introduced additional programs through Bridge to Justice. There were mentorship initiatives pairing police officers with at-risk youth, community cleanup events, and even joint basketball games to break down barriers. One afternoon, during a particularly spirited game, Marcus, the boy John mentored, surprised everyone by sinking a three-pointer. The crowd erupted in cheers, and even Officer Thompson, another of John's former arresting officers, clapped enthusiastically. As the players huddled together afterward, John overheard Marcus telling Officer Thompson, "You're not so bad for a cop." Officer Thompson chuckled, "And you're not so bad for a future NBA star." As Bridge to Justice gained traction, John found himself invited to speak at events across the state. His story, and the story of his father's legacy, resonated with people from all walks of life. At one such event, held at a university auditorium, John spoke to a packed crowd. "My father believed in the power of love to conquer hate," he said, his voice steady and clear. "And I've learned that love isn't just a feeling, it's action. It's showing up, listening, and doing the hard work to make things right." Afterward, a young student approached him. "Mr. Carter," she said, her eyes bright with hope, "I want to help. What can I do?" John smiled. "Start with your community. Look for ways to build bridges where there are walls. And don't be afraid to stand up for what's right." The student nodded, determination shining in her eyes. As the months turned into a year, John looked back on how far he had come. The fear and humiliation of his arrest had transformed into a sense of purpose and connection. Through Bridge to Justice, he had not only honored his father's legacy, but also forged his own path. One evening, as he sat on his porch with Martha, she reached over and squeezed his hand. "You've made me so proud, John," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Your father would be proud too." John smiled, the weight of her words sinking in. "I finally understand what he was fighting for, Mom, and I'm glad I can continue that fight in my own way." The night air was cool and peaceful as they sat together, the stars shining brightly above. For the first time in a long time, John felt a deep sense of peace, not because the work was done, but because he had found his place in it. As John and the officers worked side by side, the transformation within the community became evident. At first, the officers were hesitant, their previous methods clashing with the open and empathetic approach John encouraged. But as time went on, they began to see the world through the eyes of those they served. Officer Davis, who had once been quick to act without understanding, found himself listening more carefully during calls. He took the time to ask questions and build trust, rather than relying solely on protocol. Officer Thompson, similarly, started to connect with the community in ways he never had before, learning the names and stories of the people he met. The youth center became a hub of activity and optimism. John poured his heart into every moment he spent there, his dedication infectious to everyone around him. "Mr. John," one of the teens, a spirited girl named Tiana, said one evening as they were cleaning up after an art workshop. "How do you always stay so hopeful, even when things are hard?" John smiled at her, the memory of his father's teachings flooding back. "Because I believe that change starts with one small step," he replied. "It doesn't happen overnight, but every kind word, every thoughtful action, it all adds up." Tiana nodded, her eyes bright with inspiration. "I want to help too," she said. "Maybe I could organize a fundraiser for the center." John's heart swelled with pride. "That's a great idea, Tiana. Let's make it happen." Word of the youth center's success began to spread. The once quiet building now bustled with life, drawing people from all walks of life to contribute in their own way. Mrs. Johnson, a retired teacher, started tutoring sessions, helping kids with math and reading. Mr. Ramirez, the neighborhood mechanic, hosted workshops to teach teens basic car maintenance skills. Even Martha found her place in the growing movement, baking treats for events and sharing stories of her husband's resilience and courage. "Your father believed in this kind of work," she told John one day as they set up for a community cleanup event. "He'd be so proud of what you've built." John smiled at his mother, her unwavering support a constant source of strength. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," he said. The impact of their efforts rippled through the neighborhood. Crime rates began to drop as trust between residents and the police improved. The streets felt safer, more welcoming. People greeted each other warmly, and a sense of community pride took root. One Saturday morning, John organized a massive cleanup day. Over 100 people showed up, armed with trash bags, gardening tools, and paintbrushes. Families worked alongside local business owners, city officials, and even police officers to beautify the neighborhood. As John watched a diverse group of people repainting an old, weathered building, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "This," he thought, "is what my father fought for." The youth center became more than a place for children to gather after school. It was a symbol of hope and progress. People of all ages flocked to its events and programs, drawn by the sense of belonging it offered. John, at the center of it all, led by example. His calm demeanor and unshakable belief in the power of kindness inspired everyone around him. He taught the children about his father's legacy, about the civil rights movement, the importance of peaceful protest, and the enduring strength of love over hate. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John sat alone in the now quiet center. The hum of the day's activities had faded, leaving him with his thoughts. He closed his eyes, allowing the stillness to envelop him. In that moment, he felt an undeniable presence, not a ghostly apparition, but a comforting warmth. It was as if his father's spirit was there, encouraging him, reminding him that he was on the right path. John opened his eyes, a small smile playing on his lips. For the first time, he felt truly connected to his father. Though they had never met, he realized that James Carter lived on in his actions, in his values, and in the legacy he was now carrying forward. As John's initiatives flourished, he found himself working more closely with the officers who had once been a source of pain. Officer Davis and Officer Thompson, once symbols of injustice, became allies in his mission. Their transformation didn't come easily. At community events, the officers often faced skeptical glances and whispered criticisms. "How can you trust them after what they did?" people would ask John. With a deep breath, John would reply, "Forgiveness is a bridge, not a wall. If we want to move forward, we have to build that bridge together." Officer Davis, moved by John's unwavering resolve, began to speak openly at community forums. "I was wrong," he admitted during one such meeting, "but I'm here to learn and do better. I want to make amends." These small acts of accountability began to shift the community's perception. Trust grew slowly but steadily, built on shared efforts and open dialogue. One afternoon, as John and Officer Thompson painted a mural at the youth center, a young boy approached them shyly. "Can I help?" he asked, clutching a tiny paintbrush. Officer Thompson knelt to the boy's level, smiling warmly. "Of course. Grab some paint. We could use your help." John watched the interaction, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. This was the power of forgiveness and collaboration, the foundation of a brighter future. As time passed, the collaboration between the police and the community grew stronger. The barriers that once divided them began to crumble, replaced by mutual respect and understanding. Officer Davis and Officer Thompson were no longer seen as outsiders, but as integral members of the community. One day, while helping to organize a mentorship program, Officer Davis approached John. "I owe you more than an apology," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I owe you my thanks. Working with this community has changed me in ways I never thought possible." John smiled, his expression kind. "We've all grown, Officer Davis. That's the beauty of coming together. We're stronger when we work as one." As they continued their work, John saw the profound effect the youth center was having on the younger generation. Children who once seemed lost now walked with confidence. Teens who had struggled to find their place now found purpose in mentoring others. The culmination of their efforts came in the form of a community festival. The youth center buzzed with excitement as volunteers decorated the halls and set up booths in the surrounding park. There were food stands, art exhibits, and a stage for performances, all designed to showcase the vibrant, united spirit of the neighborhood. As the festival began, John stood on the sidelines, watching families laugh and children play. A sense of pride swelled in his chest as he took in the diversity of the crowd. People who once avoided each other now shared stories, smiles, and laughter. Martha joined him, a proud smile lighting up her face. "Look at what you've done, John," she said softly. "Your father would be so proud." John nodded, his heart full. "It's not just me, Mom. It's everyone. This is what Dad believed in. Community, unity, love." The festival's highlight was the unveiling of a mural at the youth center, painted by local kids and artists. The artwork depicted scenes of unity, families working together, children playing, and police officers and residents shaking hands. At the center of it all was a portrait of Reverend James Carter, his serene expression radiating hope. When the mural was revealed, a hush fell over the crowd. Then, one by one, people began to clap. The applause grew until it echoed through the streets. John stepped forward to address the crowd. "This mural represents everything we've accomplished together," he began, his voice steady. "It's a testament to the power of love and forgiveness, and to the strength we find in unity. My father believed in these values, and I see them alive in all of you today." As the festival wound down, John found himself reflecting on how far they had come. He thought about his arrest, the humiliation and fear he'd felt that day. It was a painful memory, but one that had led him to this moment of triumph. Officer Thompson approached him, holding 2 cups of lemonade. "For you?" he said, offering one to John. "Thanks," John said, taking the cup. They stood side by side, watching the crowd. "You know," Thompson began, "when I first met you, I never would have imagined we'd be here working together." John chuckled softly. "Me neither, but life has a funny way of surprising us." Thompson nodded, his expression serious. "You've taught me a lot, John. Not just about this community, but about what it means to be a better person. Thank you for giving me the chance to change." John turned to face him, his voice firm. "It wasn't just me, Officer Thompson. You had to make the choice to do better, and you did. That's what matters." As the evening sky turned shades of orange and purple, John realized how much his life had changed. He was no longer just the man who went to work and came home, living a quiet, unassuming life. He had become a leader, someone who inspired others and carried his father's legacy forward in his own unique way. One week after the festival, John and Martha visited Reverend James Carter's grave once more. This time, they brought with them a framed photo of the mural from the youth center. As they stood before the headstone, John placed the photo at its base. "Dad," he said softly, "we've come a long way. The community is stronger, and we're working together like you always believed we could. I hope I've made you proud." Martha placed a hand on John's shoulder. "You've done more than that, son. You've honored his memory in the best way possible, by living his values." John closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he was fulfilling his father's dream in ways he never could have imagined. John's work was far from over. The youth center continued to grow, drawing in more volunteers and inspiring similar initiatives in neighboring communities. The collaboration with the police department became a model for other cities, proving that change was possible when people came together with open hearts and minds. But for John, the greatest reward wasn't in the recognition or accolades. It was in the small moments, the smiles of the kids at the center, the way neighbors now greeted each other warmly, and the sense of belonging that filled the community. One evening, as he walked through the neighborhood, John noticed Tiana and Marcus painting a new mural on the side of a building. It depicted children holding hands with adults of all backgrounds with the words, "Together we thrive," painted boldly above them. John approached the two teens, a proud smile on his face. "This is amazing," he said. "You're carrying on the work." Tiana grinned. "We learned from the best," Mr. John Marcus nodded. "Yeah, you showed us that we can make a difference." As John watched them work, he felt a profound sense of hope for the future. He realized that the legacy of love and justice his father had begun would continue to grow, carried forward by new generations. With each passing day, John found new ways to honor his father's memory while forging his own path. He knew the road ahead would have challenges, but he was ready to face them, armed with the lessons of the past and the strength of his community. And in the quiet moments, when he stood alone under the stars or sat in the stillness of the youth center after a long day, he felt his father's presence, an enduring reminder that love, justice, and unity would always light the way forward. Every day at the youth center brought new challenges and rewards. John dedicated himself fully, pouring his energy into creating a safe, inspiring environment for everyone who walked through its doors. He noticed subtle but significant changes in the children who frequented the center. At first, many of them had been guarded, unsure if they could trust the adults trying to guide them. But over time, they began to open up. The quiet kids started speaking their minds, the rowdy ones channeled their energy into productive activities, and the once distrustful teens began forming bonds with the mentors who volunteered their time. One afternoon, Marcus, a boy John had been mentoring, hesitated before asking, "Mr. John, do you think I could ever do something as important as you and your dad?" John crouched down to meet Marcus's eyes. "Marcus," he said warmly, "you already have everything you need to make a difference. It doesn't matter how big or small your actions are. What matters is doing them with kindness and purpose." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "So like helping my neighbor carry groceries? Or making sure no one's left out at school?" "Exactly," John said with a smile. "Every act of kindness adds up. It's like planting seeds. Each one grows into something bigger than you can imagine." Moments like these made the long hours worthwhile. The youth center wasn't just a place to keep kids out of trouble. It was becoming a cornerstone of the community, a beacon of hope that attracted people of all ages and backgrounds. The transformation wasn't limited to the children. The police officers who had once wronged John had become some of his strongest allies. Officer Thompson, in particular, had developed a remarkable rapport with the teens at the center. He took the time to teach them about safety, conflict resolution, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. One evening, as they set up chairs for a town hall meeting, Thompson turned to John. "You know," he began, hesitating, "I never thought I'd feel so connected to this community. I've been a cop for over a decade, but I feel like I've learned more about people in these past few months than in all those years combined." John smiled at him. "That's because you've been listening, Thompson. When we take the time to understand each other, it changes everything." The town hall meeting that evening was packed. Families sat alongside business owners, city officials, and local police officers. The atmosphere was a far cry from the tension that had defined earlier gatherings. Now there was a palpable sense of unity and collaboration. During the meeting, a young woman named Sierra stood up to share her story. "I used to think nothing would ever change here," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But seeing what Mr. Carter and everyone else has done, it gives me hope. It makes me believe we can build something better." Her words were met with applause, and John felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked around the room, seeing faces filled with determination and optimism. This was what his father had fought for, and John knew they were just getting started. A few months later, the youth center hosted its largest event yet, a community festival celebrating the progress they had made together. The park outside the center was transformed into a lively gathering place, with colorful tents, food trucks, and activity booths. John and Martha arrived early to oversee the preparations. Martha carried a tray of her famous brownies, which she handed off to a group of eager volunteers. "These always go fast," she said with a wink. As the festival got underway, John marveled at the turnout. Families played games together, neighbors shared stories, and police officers mingled with residents in a way that felt natural and genuine. On the main stage, local performers entertained the crowd with music and spoken-word poetry. One performer, a teenage girl named Tiana, recited a poem she had written about hope and resilience. Her words brought tears to many eyes, including John's. "Tiana, that was beautiful," he told her afterward. "Thanks, Mr. John," she said shyly. "You inspire me. I wanted to write something that would inspire others, too." The highlight of the festival was the unveiling of a new mural on the side of the youth center. Painted by local artists and children, the mural depicted scenes of unity and progress, families working together, police officers shaking hands with residents, and children playing in a vibrant neighborhood. At the center of it all was a portrait of Reverend James Carter, his expression calm and resolute. As the cloth covering the mural was removed, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. The artwork was breathtaking, a vivid representation of everything they had accomplished together. John stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "This mural isn't just about the past," he said. "It's about the future we're building together. My father believed in the power of love and unity to change the world, and today I see that power in all of you." Martha stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. As the festival wound down, John found himself standing near the mural, watching families take photos and share stories. He thought about how far they had come since the day of his arrest. What had once been a source of pain had transformed into a catalyst for growth and change. Officer Davis approached him, his expression reflective. "John," he said, "I've been thinking a lot about what forgiveness really means. You didn't just forgive us, you gave us a chance to be better. That's something I'll never forget." John nodded. "Forgiveness is the first step. The real work comes after, when we choose to grow and learn." Davis extended his hand. "Thank you for everything." As they shook hands, John felt a deep sense of closure. He had taken something painful and turned it into a source of strength, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Weeks later, John and Martha returned to Reverend Carter's grave, carrying a framed photograph of the mural. They placed it at the base of the headstone along with fresh flowers. "Dad," John said softly, "we're continuing your work. The community is thriving, and people are coming together in ways I never thought possible. Thank you for showing us the way." Martha wiped a tear from her cheek. "He would be so proud of you, John. I know I am." As they stood in silence, John felt a sense of peace unlike anything he had known before. He wasn't just honoring his father's memory, he was living it. The youth center continued to grow, inspiring similar initiatives in nearby towns. John became a sought-after speaker, sharing his story and encouraging others to build bridges in their own communities. But for John, the true reward was seeing the children he mentored thrive. Marcus, now a confident teenager, had started his own gardening club at school. Tiana had written a book of poetry, which she dedicated to John and the youth center. One evening, as John locked up the center, he paused to look at the mural one last time before heading home. The words at the bottom read, "Together, we thrive." John smiled, knowing that his father's legacy was alive and well, not just in the mural or the programs they had built, but in the lives of everyone who had been touched by their efforts. The youth center had become a second home for John, a place where his father's values of love, justice, and equality lived on through action. Every wall, every program, and every smiling face inside the center was a testament to the progress they had made. But as the center grew busier and more vibrant, John realized it wasn't enough to simply react to problems. He needed to create opportunities that would prevent them from arising in the first place. He began working on a series of new initiatives aimed at addressing the root causes of inequality in the community. One of these initiatives was a mentorship program called Pathways to Success, which paired local professionals with young people. The goal was to inspire the next generation to dream bigger and show them that their aspirations were within reach. At the launch event, John spoke to a room packed with kids, parents, and mentors. "When I was younger," he began, "I didn't fully understand the importance of having someone believe in you. But now I see that a single mentor can change a life. Today, we're planting seeds for a brighter future." The mentors included teachers, business owners, artists, and even Officer Thompson, who had volunteered to teach teens about careers in public service. Watching the kids light up as they spoke with their mentors filled John with a profound sense of accomplishment. As John's vision for the community expanded, so did his responsibilities. He began collaborating with city officials to address larger issues, like affordable housing and access to education. The youth center became the heart of these efforts, hosting town hall meetings and workshops. One such meeting focused on creating a scholarship fund for local students. John worked tirelessly to secure funding, reaching out to businesses and philanthropic organizations. His persistence paid off when a local tech company donated $50,000 to kickstart the program. At the scholarship fund's launch, John stood before a crowd of eager students and proud parents. "This isn't just an investment in education," he said. "It's an investment in our future. When we lift each other up, we all rise together." Among the first scholarship recipients was Tiana, who planned to study creative writing in college. She hugged John tightly after the ceremony, tears streaming down her face. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself," she said. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Despite the progress being made, John couldn't ignore the lingering wounds in the community. Some residents still struggled to trust the police, and he knew that forgiveness was a journey, not a destination. To foster healing, John organized a series of storytelling circles where residents and officers could share their experiences. These circles were intimate gatherings designed to build empathy and understanding. At one such event, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, spoke about her late husband. "He was a good man," she said, her voice trembling. "But he was treated unfairly his whole life because of the color of his skin. That pain doesn't go away easily." Officer Davis listened intently before responding. "Mrs. Henderson, I can't undo what you and your husband went through, but I want you to know that I hear you. Your story matters, and it's changing the way I see my role as a police officer." The storytelling circles became a cornerstone of John's efforts, helping to bridge divides that had seemed insurmountable. As John's work continued, he found himself thinking more often about his father. He spent evenings poring over old newspapers, reading articles about Reverend James Carter's speeches and protests. The more he learned, the more he felt connected to the man he had never met. One day, Martha brought out a box of her husband's belongings. Inside were faded photographs, handwritten notes, and a journal James had kept during the height of the civil rights movement. "Your father wrote everything down," Martha said, her voice tinged with emotion. "His hopes, his fears, his plans for the future." John opened the journal carefully, his fingers brushing against the pages. In his father's elegant handwriting, he read, "The fight for justice is long, but it is worth every sacrifice. I pray that one day my son will live in a world where love truly conquers hate." Tears filled John's eyes as he read the words. It felt as though his father was speaking directly to him, urging him to keep going. Word of John's work began to spread beyond the neighborhood. Nearby communities invited him to speak at their events, hoping to replicate his success. John embraced the opportunity, viewing it as a way to honor his father's legacy on a larger scale. At one event, held in a high school auditorium, John addressed an audience of students, parents, and educators. "Change starts with us," he said. "It starts with small acts of kindness, with listening to each other, and with refusing to let fear divide us." Afterward, a young boy approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Carter," he said, "do you think I can help my friends at school? There's a lot of bullying, and I don't know how to stop it." John knelt to meet the boy's gaze. "You can absolutely make a difference," he said. "Stand up for what's right, and don't be afraid to ask others for help. Together, you can create a kinder school." The boy nodded, a determined look on his face. One quiet evening, John sat alone in the youth center, reflecting on everything that had happened. The room was dimly lit, with only the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating the space. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the pain of his arrest, the revelation of his father's identity, and the countless hours of work he had poured into the community. As he gazed at the mural on the wall, John felt a profound sense of peace. His father's image, surrounded by scenes of unity and progress, seemed to watch over him. "You were right, Dad," John whispered. "Love really can conquer hate." The impact of John's work extended far beyond the neighborhood. Crime rates continued to drop, students graduated with new opportunities, and relationships between residents and police officers grew stronger. The youth center became a model for other communities, inspiring similar initiatives across the city. John was often invited to share his insights, but he always emphasized one thing. This isn't about one person. It's about all of us, working together to create something better. One day, as John walked through the center, he noticed Marcus leading a group of younger kids in an art project. Tiana was nearby, helping them write stories to accompany their drawings. "You're doing great work," John told them. Marcus grinned. "We had a great teacher." John felt his heart swell with pride. He realized that the legacy of love and justice his father had begun would continue to grow, carried forward by the next generation.